December 18, 1944. Above the frozen fields of Alsace, France, 14,000 feet. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 screamed through the winter sky, its Daimler-Benz engine howling like a mechanical wolf. Inside the cramped cockpit, Hauptmann Hans Vogel's gloved hand gripped the control stick, his thumb resting on the cannon trigger. Below, the patchwork landscape of occupied France spread like a tattered quilt, brown earth, white snow, the dark ribbons of roads where Allied convoys crawled toward Germany. Vogel didn't see the P-47 Thunderbolt until it was too late. The first burst of 50 caliber rounds punched through the fuselage behind him. He felt the aircraft shudder, heard the sharp metallic screams of aluminum being torn. Then the second burst. This one found the fuel tank. The explosion wasn't dramatic, not like in the propaganda films. It was intimate. A whoosh of superheated air. A wall of orange flame that filled the cockpit in an instant. Fire has its own language. It roars, crackles, whispers promises of oblivion. But what Vogel would remember, in the seconds before unconsciousness, in the months of morphine dreams that followed, was the smell. Aviation fuel mixed with burning leather, scorched metal, and something else. Something organic. His own flesh, caramelizing like meat forgotten on a stove. His hands went to his face instinctively. The gloves melted into his fingers. The silk scarf around his neck, the one embroidered with his squadron's emblem, the one he'd worn for 80 victories, fused with his skin. He managed to jettison the canopy. The winter air at 14,000 feet should have been a mercy. Instead, it was agony flash-freezing the boiling fluids on his exposed tissues. He pulled the ripcord. The parachute opened. And Hans Vogel, the face of the Reich's aerial supremacy, the man whose chiseled features had stared from recruitment posters in every German city, descended into enemy hands as something else entirely. A monster. To understand what Hans Vogel lost in those flames, you must first understand what he had been. Born in 1919 in Munich, Bavaria, Vogel came of age as National Socialism reshaped Germany's understanding of human worth. By the time he joined the Luftwaffe in 1938, he had absorbed a philosophy that reduced humanity to a hierarchy of blood and bone. At the apex stood the Aryan ideal. Tall, blonde, physically perfect. At the bottom, those deemed lebensunwertes Leben. Life unworthy of life, the disfigured, the disabled, the broken. Vogel himself had been the propaganda machine's dream. 6 feet tall, with the square jaw and ice-blue eyes that appeared on 1,000 posters. His personnel file, now yellowing in archives, contains a photograph from 1943. Oberleutnant Vogel in dress uniform, Knight's Cross at his throat, his face symmetrical, classical, Teutonic. The caption, written in the dramatic style of Goebbels' ministry, proclaimed him der Adler des Reiches, the eagle of the Reich. He believed it. Why wouldn't he? Every institution, every authority figure, every propaganda film reinforced the same message. Germany's strength lay in its racial purity, its physical perfection, its ruthless elimination of weakness. He had visited the House of German Art in Munich, where paintings celebrated muscular warriors and Nordic goddesses. He had read the pamphlets explaining how the Reich humanely euthanized the mentally ill, the physically deformed, saving them from lives of suffering while preserving the genetic stock of the Volk. 80 aerial victories. 80 times he had sent enemy aircraft spiraling earthward, their pilots trapped in burning cockpits just as he would be. He wore the kill markings on his rudder with pride. Each one was a service to the fatherland, a defense of civilization against the mongrel hordes threatening Europe. And then in 17 seconds of flame, Hans Vogel crossed the invisible line. From human to unhuman. From hero to horror. The American patrol found him in a snow-covered field 3 miles from where his aircraft had cratered into the earth. He was conscious, barely. The parachute silk, incredibly, had protected his body from the worst of the impact. But his face and hands were exposed to the winter air, and by the time the soldiers reached him, frost had formed on the wounds. One of the Americans, a private from Ohio whose name Vogel never learned, vomited at the sight. They wrapped him in a wool blanket and carried him to a field hospital. Through the morphine haze, Vogel waited for what came next. He knew with the certainty of ideology what happened to prisoners like him. The Americans would see his ruined face, recognize him as a burden, a waste of precious medical resources. They would, in their own way, with their own justifications, dispose of him. Perhaps a lethal injection administered with clinical efficiency. Perhaps simple neglect, letting infection do the work. Perhaps, if they were feeling vindictive, something more theatrical. He had been taught that Americans were soft, sentimental about enemies until they weren't, that their democracy was weakness disguised as principle. But they kept him alive. They transported him to a larger facility, then to another. Each move brought better medical care, not worse. Doctors, real doctors, not sadists, examined his wounds. Nurses changed his bandages. The morphine kept coming, keeping the pain at a manageable roar instead of a consuming shriek. 3 weeks after his capture, still wrapped in gauze like a mummy, Vogel was loaded onto a C-47 transport aircraft. He could hear American voices discussing his case. The words meant nothing to him. His English was limited to basic aviation terminology, but the tone was professional, detached. Clinical? They landed at an airfield in southern England. An ambulance drove him through the Sussex countryside. Rolling hills, dormant winter fields, villages with names like Crawley and Copthorne. And finally a sign, Queen Victoria Hospital, East Grinstead. What Hans Vogel couldn't know as they wheeled him through the hospital's entrance, was that he had just arrived at the most revolutionary reconstructive surgery center in the world. A place where burned pilots were being remade, where the impossible was becoming routine, where an American surgeon was pioneering techniques that would transform medicine. A place that would force him to reconsider everything he believed about humanity, cruelty, and the value of a life. Major Joseph Miller hadn't planned on becoming a sculptor of human faces. Born in Boston in 1908, he'd trained at Harvard Medical School with the intention of becoming a general surgeon. But in 1938, he'd spent 6 months observing pioneering plastic surgeon Dr. John Stage Davis at Johns Hopkins. There, he'd watched Davis repair a child's cleft palate, transform a woman's acid-burned face, restore a factory worker's crushed hand. Miller discovered he wasn't just good at this work. He was exceptional. When America entered the war in December 1941, Miller joined the Medical Corps with the rank of captain. By 1944, promoted to major, he was attached to a joint Anglo-American medical team at Queen Victoria Hospital, working alongside the legendary British surgeon Archibald McIndoe. McIndoe had established the hospital as the primary treatment center for burned RAF pilots, the men who would form the Guinea Pig Club, a brotherhood of the scarred. But Miller brought something unique to East Grinstead, an American approach to the walking stalk pedicle graft technique, a method so revolutionary, so audacious, it seemed closer to magic than medicine. The principle was simple, even if the execution was agonizingly complex. To rebuild a face destroyed by fire, you needed new skin. But you couldn't simply cut a patch from one part of the body and sew it onto another. The graft would die, deprived of blood supply. Instead, Miller created a walking bridge of living tissue. He would cut a flap of skin from the patient's chest or abdomen, leaving one end attached to preserve blood flow. Then, over weeks, he would gradually extend this flap, creating a tube of living tissue. The tube would be attached to the patient's wrist, where it would walk for weeks, establishing new blood vessels. Finally, the wrist would be positioned next to the face, and the tube of skin would be transferred, bringing its blood supply with it. Only then would the original attachment be severed. The entire process took months, sometimes years. It required extraordinary surgical precision, perfect timing, and something else, something Miller's colleagues noticed but rarely articulated. It required believing that the patient, no matter how disfigured, was worth the effort. That belief wasn't universal even in Allied hospitals. Resources were scarce. Surgeons faced impossible choices daily. A man burned beyond recognition, his productive life effectively over. Why not focus medical attention on soldiers who could return to combat? Miller's answer was characteristically blunt: because we're not goddamn Nazis. January 12, 1945. Ward 3, Queen Victoria Hospital. The bandages had been on for 26 days, long enough for the initial swelling to subside, for the worst of the burns to stabilize, for Hans Vogel's body to decide whether it would fight to survive or surrender to sepsis. It chose survival. Now surrounded by a medical team of 7, including Major Miller, 2 British surgeons, 3 nurses, and a medical photographer, Vogel lay on a surgical table as they prepared to see what remained of his face. Miller worked slowly, methodically, cutting through layer after layer of gauze. He'd reviewed Vogel's file that morning. Luftwaffe captain, 80 confirmed kills. A photograph from his service record showed the face that had been strong nose, defined cheekbones, the kind of face sculptors used as reference for classical heroes. That face was gone. As the final layer of bandage fell away, Miller maintained his professional composure. 30 years of surgical training had taught him to see wounds clinically as problems to solve rather than horrors to flee. But even he felt his stomach tighten. The fire had been thorough. Vogel's nose was gone, just a cavity where cartilage and bone showed through. His lips had contracted into a permanent grimace, exposing teeth. The left eye was sealed shut, the eyelid melted into a smooth expanse of scar tissue. The right eye could still open, but the eyelid no longer functioned properly. His ears were reduced to nubs of cartilage, and across everything the terrible topography of burn scars. Some areas smooth and shiny, others puckered and ridged, all of it colored in shades of red, pink, and mottled white. One of the nurses new to the burns unit turned away. Miller leaned closer, examining Vogel's eye, the one that could still see. He recognized the expression there. He'd seen it in dozens of burned pilots, British and American and Canadian. The look of a man waiting for the world to turn away in disgust. But Vogel's expression held something else, too. Something Miller hadn't seen before. Not just fear or shame, but expectation. The certainty that this was where his usefulness ended, where his captor's tolerance would finally snap. Miller straightened, spoke to his team in English, knowing Vogel couldn't understand. Full thickness burns across approximately 70% of facial surface area. Third degree with deep tissue damage to nasal structure, bilateral auricular tissue, periorbital regions. Extensive contracture of perioral tissue. He paused. Reconstruction is possible. I'll need to design a staged approach. We'll start with the eyelids, get that right eye protected, then build a framework for the nose. The walking stalk technique for major grafts. Timeline is probably 18 months, maybe 2 years. One of the British surgeons, a man named Philip Graves, who'd been working on burned pilots since 1940, cleared his throat. Major Miller, with respect, this is an enemy prisoner. We have 23 Allied pilots waiting for reconstructive procedures. Resources are limited. Perhaps palliative care would be more appropriate. Miller turned to face Graves. The American's expression was mild, but his voice carried steel. Dr. Graves, let me make something very clear. In this hospital, there are no enemy prisoners. There are only patients. This man needs reconstruction. We have the skill to provide it. Therefore, we will provide it. He glanced at the rest of the team. Anyone uncomfortable with that can request a transfer. I'll sign the paperwork myself. Silence. Miller turned back to Vogel, made eye contact with that one functioning eye, and smiled. Not with pity, but with the satisfaction of an artist contemplating a challenging project. Vogel, who couldn't understand the words but recognized the exchange, felt something crack in his understanding of the world. These people weren't discussing how to dispose of him. They were arguing about how to save him. Ward 3 at Queen Victoria Hospital wasn't like other military medical facilities. There were no rigid ranks, no saluting, no military protocol. Patients wore civilian clothes when they could. They gathered in the common room to play cards, read newspapers, argue about Churchill and Roosevelt and who would win the war. Twice a week, those well enough to walk made the short journey into East Grinstead proper to the Whitehall restaurant where they drank beer and ate fish and chips, and tried to remember what it felt like to be part of normal human society. The townspeople of East Grinstead had been prepared for the sight of burned men. McIndoe had worked with local leaders to ensure his patients wouldn't face stares or whispers. Shopkeepers learned not to react. Children were taught that these men were heroes, that their scars were badges of honor. When a pilot with half a face walked into a pub, the barman poured him a pint without hesitation. It was a deliberate therapeutic approach. McIndoe called it social rehabilitation. The idea was revolutionary. Don't hide disfigured patients away. Don't treat them as objects of pity. Give them dignity, normalcy, a reason to believe they could rejoin the world. The patients themselves, hundreds of RAF pilots burned in Spitfires and Hurricanes, had formed a club. They called themselves the Guinea Pig Club, acknowledging their role as experimental subjects in McIndoe and Miller's pioneering surgical techniques. They had a coat of arms, a guinea pig with wings, gripping a surgeon's scalpel. Their motto, per ardua ad astra, through adversity to the stars. Hans Vogel, immobile in his bed in the first weeks, heard their voices in the hallway. Laughter. Actual laughter from men who looked like walking nightmares. He heard them complain about the food, debate cricket scores, discuss the upcoming invasion of Germany as if they were ordinary soldiers, not ruined remnants. It violated everything he understood about human nature. In Germany, the disfigured were hidden, the blind veterans relegated to institutions, the burned soldiers given mercy deaths, officially to spare them suffering, unofficially because their appearance was an embarrassment to the Reich's mythology of invincibility. Weakness was shameful. Disfigurement was intolerable. But here, these broken men were being treated as if they still mattered. Squadron leader Tom Mackenzie, a New Zealander whose face had been reconstructed over 18 months, visited Vogel's bed in late January. Mackenzie's face was a patchwork of grafted skin, his nose rebuilt from rib cartilage, his eyelids fashioned from skin that had once covered his chest. He looked, objectively, bizarre, but he moved with confidence, spoke with humor. "Heard you're German," Mackenzie said, settling into a chair beside the bed. One of the nurses had translated for him, a young woman named Sarah who'd studied German at Cambridge. "Suppose that makes us enemies officially. But in here, you're just another poor bastard who met fire and lost." He grinned, the expression grotesque on his reconstructed face. "Welcome to the Guinea Pig Club. Memberships for life, and the dues are paid in pain." Through Sarah's translation, Vogel managed to ask the question that had been burning in his mind. Why? Why what? Why do they... Vogel gestured vaguely at his own ruined face, at Mackenzie's rebuilt one. Why waste resources? Why not just... He didn't finish, couldn't articulate the expectation of disposal that still sat in his chest like a stone. Mackenzie leaned back, considering. "You know what Miller told me once? Said, every time I rebuild a face, I'm proving something important. I'm proving that we're different from them, that we don't give up on people just because they're inconvenient or expensive or ugly. That's the entire point of this war, proving that human dignity isn't negotiable." He stood to leave. "You'll learn, friend? You're not a monster here. You're a project. And Miller doesn't leave projects unfinished." February 1945. Operating Theater 2. The first surgery wasn't dramatic. No removing of faces, no dramatic transformations. Just eyelids. Vogel's right eye had survived the fire intact, the eyeball itself undamaged, but the eyelid had contracted, leaving the eye constantly exposed. Without the ability to blink, to lubricate, the eye would ulcerate and fail within months. Miller needed to build new eyelids from scratch. The procedure took 4 hours. Miller cut thin flaps of skin from behind Vogel's ear, the only facial skin that had escaped burning. He fashioned these into upper and lower lids, attaching them with sutures finer than human hair. He created a mechanism for blinking using remaining muscle tissue. It was microsurgery decades before the term existed, performed under loupes with tools Miller had designed himself. When Vogel woke in recovery, the sensation was alien. His eye could close, could blink, could rest. A function so basic, so automatic, that no one thinks about it until it's gone. And now, impossibly, it was returning. Miller visited during evening rounds. Checked the sutures, examined for signs of infection, nodded with satisfaction. Through Sarah's translation, he explained the next steps. "We need to build scaffolding for a nose," Miller said, sketching on a notepad. "I'll take cartilage from your ribs, you won't miss it, and craft a framework. Then we'll need skin to cover it. That's where the walking stock technique comes in. It'll take time, weeks for each stage, but you'll have a nose again. Won't be the one you were born with, but it'll function. You'll breathe. You'll smell. You'll look..." He paused, choosing his words. "Human." Vogel, still groggy from anesthesia, asked Sarah to translate a question. "Why me? Why not your own men first?" Miller's answer was immediate. "Because you're here. Because you need it. Because I can do it." He packed his instruments. "The war will end eventually. Maybe in months. When it does, you'll go home to Germany. And when you get there, I want you to remember something. Remember that when you were at your lowest, when you had nothing to offer, when you were the enemy and a burden and everything your ideology taught you was disposable, remember that an American doctor spent 2 years rebuilding your face. Remember that we treated you like you mattered. Remember and wonder what that says about the philosophy you were fighting for. He left, and Vogel, alone with his thoughts and his single blinking eye, felt the foundations of his worldview begin to crack. March 1945. The procedure Miller had described began. They called it the walking stock pedicle graft, but the technical name obscured the reality. They were going to attach Vogel's wrist to his face for 3 months. Miller made the first incision along Vogel's chest, a long rectangle of skin, 6 inches by 2 inches. He cut deep down to the muscle, leaving one end attached to preserve blood supply. Then, with meticulous care, he rolled the flap into a tube, suturing it closed. The tube remained connected to Vogel's chest, blood flowing through it, keeping the tissue alive. Over the next 2 weeks, Miller gradually extended the tube, creating a bridge of living flesh that arched from Vogel's chest to his abdomen. It looked absurd, biological origami. But inside that tube, blood vessels were multiplying, strengthening, preparing for their eventual purpose. Then came the transfer to the wrist. Miller detached one end of the tube from the abdomen and sutured it to Vogel's left wrist. Now the tube connected chest to wrist, a fleshy arc that Vogel had to keep immobilized. He slept sitting up, his arm carefully positioned to avoid tension on the graft. Any sudden movement could tear the delicate blood vessels, killing the tissue. For 3 weeks, the tube lived on Vogel's wrist, establishing new circulation. And then, in late April, the final transfer. Miller positioned Vogel's wrist next to his face, detached the tube from his chest, carefully opened the tube and began draping it across the burned cavity where Vogel's nose had been. The tissue, now with dual blood supply from both wrist and face, was sutured into place with hundreds of tiny stitches. Vogel's wrist remained attached to his face for another 6 weeks. He couldn't move his head, couldn't eat normally, could barely sleep. He was trapped, literally bound to his own reconstruction, his wrist sutured to his cheek as blood vessels slowly integrated with facial tissue. Other patients in the ward, British pilots undergoing similar procedures, joked about it, called themselves the Elephant Men, made bets on who would go insane first from the immobility, found humor because the alternative was despair. But Vogel couldn't participate in the camaraderie. Language barriers, yes. But more than that, the growing cognitive dissonance between what he'd been taught and what he was experiencing. In Germany, people like him were ballast existenzen, ballast existences, dead weight. The propaganda had been clear. The Reich couldn't afford to waste resources on those who couldn't contribute. Euthanasia wasn't murder, it was mercy and economics combined. But here, Miller was spending hundreds of hours using expensive materials, mobilizing an entire medical team, all to rebuild the face of an enemy prisoner who would never fight for the Allies, never contribute to their economy, never offer anything in return, except, what? The question haunted Vogel during those 6 weeks of immobility. What did these people gain from saving him? June 1945. The war in Europe had ended. Hitler was dead, Germany in ruins. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last 1,000 years, had collapsed after 12. In East Grinstead, life continued. The hospital didn't empty just because the fighting stopped. Burns don't heal faster in peacetime. Reconstructive surgery doesn't accelerate because of treaties. Miller finally severed the connection between Vogel's wrist and face. The tube of skin had integrated successfully, establishing its own blood supply from facial vessels. Now came the delicate work of shaping it into a functional nose. Over 3 surgeries in June and July, Miller sculpted rib cartilage into a nasal framework. He positioned the cartilage beneath the grafted skin. He created nostrils, not perfect, but functional. He fashioned a bridge, a tip, the subtle architecture that makes a face recognizable as human rather than abstract horror. By August, Vogel had a nose. It didn't look like his original nose. The skin color was slightly mismatched, the shape imperfect, but it protruded from his face at the correct angle. Air flowed through it. He could breathe without relying entirely on mouth breathing. He could smell the hospital's institutional food, the lavender soap the nurses used, the cigarette smoke that clung to the doctors' white coats. The Guinea Pig Club held a small ceremony. Vogel, now mobile, was escorted to the common room. 23 reconstructed pilots, British, American, Canadian, 1 Australian, gathered around. Squadron leader Mackenzie presented him with a tie clip shaped like a guinea pig. "You're one of us now," Mackenzie announced. Welcome to the club nobody wants to join, but nobody wants to leave. One of the American pilots, a man named Jimmy Barnes, whose face was more scar tissue than original flesh, raised a beer. To the Jerry, who proved we're all the same under the scars, they drank. They laughed. And Hans Vogel, who had bombed British cities, who had killed Allied pilots, who had served an ideology built on hatred and hierarchy, Hans Vogel found himself crying. Not from pain, not from grief. From the incomprehensible realization that these men, these enemies, treated him with more humanity than his own side would have. September 1945. Vogel's English had improved enough for basic conversations. He sought out Miller between surgeries, found him in the doctor's small office, reviewing surgical plans for another patient. Why? Vogel asked. The question he'd been asking for 9 months, but now with enough language to demand a real answer. Miller looked up from his notes. Why what, specifically? Why save me? Why waste? Vogel struggled for words. Resources. Time. On enemy. On... He gestured at his partially reconstructed face. Miller leaned back in his chair, lit a cigarette, a habit he was trying to quit unsuccessfully. You want the philosophical answer or the practical one? Both. Practical first. You are a pilot. You understand aerodynamics, engineering. The walking stock technique is still experimental. Every patient teaches us something new. Your case, the severity of the burns, the complexity of the reconstruction, it's pushing the boundaries of what we can do. Every procedure on you makes us better surgeons, saves future patients. So, selfishly, you're valuable as a teaching case. And philosophical. Miller took a long drag. I'm a surgeon. My job is fixing broken things. When I see a broken body, I don't see a German or American enemy or ally. I see a puzzle that needs solving. Call it professional pride, call it ego, call it whatever you want. But I can't look at someone who needs help and just not help. That's not who I am. But in my country, your country is gone, Vogel. It lost. And one of the reasons it lost is because it built itself on lies about human worth. You were taught some people matter and some don't. That efficiency and purity are more important than compassion. That weakness should be eliminated rather than supported. Miller stubbed out the cigarette. That philosophy, taken to its logical conclusion, is what led to the camps, to the mass graves, to the idea that you can optimize humanity like you'd optimize a factory. He stood, moved to the window overlooking the hospital grounds. I'm not naive. I know America has its own problems. We've got Jim Crow in the South. We turned away Jewish refugees before the war. We're not saints. But the core idea, the founding principle, is that all men are created equal. That human dignity isn't something you earn or lose based on utility. It just is. And when we start calculating the worth of human lives based on what they can produce, when we start deciding who deserves medical care and who doesn't based on whether they're economically efficient, he turned back to Vogel. That's when we become monsters. Vogel absorbed this. You rebuild my face to prove point? Make symbol? No. I rebuild your face because it needs rebuilding and I can do it. The symbolism is just a bonus. November 1945. 18 months after the fire that destroyed his face, Hans Vogel stood before a full-length mirror in the hospital's rehabilitation wing. The reconstruction wasn't finished. Miller estimated another 6 months of procedures, refinements to the nose, work on the ears, more grafts to smooth the scarring. But Vogel could see what he would become. The face looking back at him wasn't the face from the propaganda posters. That man was gone forever, buried somewhere over France with the wreckage of his Messerschmitt. This new face was asymmetrical, patchworked, obviously reconstructed. The nose sat slightly off-center. The ears were simplified nubs. The skin tone varied from pale to pink to reddish-brown. But it was a face, recognizably human, functional. He could close his eyes, wrinkle his brow, attempt a smile. The muscles still worked. The grafts had taken. Miller stood beside him, evaluating his own work with the critical eye of an artist. Still more to do, he said. The right ear especially. And I want to do another procedure on your hands. Get you more flexibility. Vogel stared at his reflection. When you finish, when I go home, what I tell people. About this? He gestured at his face, the hospital around them. Tell them the truth. That when you were at your most vulnerable, the enemy showed you mercy. that American medicine and British compassion rebuilt you when your own side would have let you die. Tell them that maybe, just maybe, the wrong side won the war. You want me to be propaganda? For democracy? Miller laughed, short and sharp. God, no. I want you to be honest. Go home. Live your life. If someone asks about your face, tell them what happened. Don't editorialize. Don't philosophize. Just tell the story. Let them draw their own conclusions. He headed for the door, then paused. One more thing, Vogel. You know why the walking stock technique works? Why we can take skin from one part of the body and make it thrive somewhere else? Vogel shook his head. Because flesh doesn't care about ideology. Tissue doesn't recognize borders. Blood vessels don't distinguish between friend and enemy. Your body doesn't know it's supposed to be Aryan or pure or perfect. It just wants to heal. It wants to survive. It's biology, not philosophy. He smiled. Human nature isn't what Hitler said it was. It isn't tribalism and hierarchy and the strong dominating the weak. Human nature is resilience, adaptation, the ability to take devastating trauma and rebuild. That's what I see every day in this hospital. Not weakness. Strength, March 1946. The final surgery was complete. Hans Vogel, no longer Hauptmann Vogel, no longer an officer of the Luftwaffe, prepared for repatriation to Germany. The country he would return to was unrecognizable. The cities he defended from the cockpit of his Messerschmitt were ruins. Berlin, Munich, Hamburg, apocalyptic landscapes of shattered buildings and displaced people. The Nazi Party was banned, its leaders dead or imprisoned. The philosophy he'd absorbed since adolescence was now classified as a criminal ideology. Miller met him in the hospital courtyard on the day of departure. A Red Cross truck would take Vogel to a processing center, from there to Germany. Your face will continue to change, Miller said, handing over a folder of medical records. The scars will fade somewhat over the next few years. Keep the skin moisturized. Avoid excessive sun exposure. If you have complications, any German doctor can reference these files. They shook hands, a gesture that would have been impossible 18 months ago, before Miller reconstructed Vogel's burned hands. I don't know how to thank you, Vogel said, his English now fluent enough for complexity. Don't thank me. Learn from this. You came here expecting barbarism and got medicine. Expected cruelty and got compassion. Take that lesson home. Germany's going to need to rebuild itself, not just physically, but philosophically. You can be part of that, or not. Your choice. Vogel climbed into the truck. As it pulled away, he looked back at Queen Victoria Hospital, the place that had taken him as a monster and returned him as a man. The story doesn't end with Vogel's departure because history isn't a narrative with clean resolution. It's a series of reverberations, consequences that ripple forward through time. The walking stock pedicle graft technique that Miller perfected on Vogel and hundreds of other patients became standard practice in plastic surgery. Thousands of post-war burn victims, civilian and military, benefited from the procedures pioneered at East Grinstead. Modern reconstructive surgery traces its lineage directly to that Sussex hospital, to McIndoe and Miller and their revolutionary belief that disfigurement was a technical problem rather than a moral judgment. The Guinea Pig Club still exists. Its members gather annually, now elderly men in their 80s and 90s, to commemorate their shared experience. They tell stories of Miller's perfectionism, of McIndoe's innovative techniques, of the town of East Grinstead that welcomed them when the world would have turned away. And Hans Vogel? Records of his post-war life are fragmentary, filtered through the chaos of occupied Germany and the fractured archives of the Cold War. But there are traces, enough to suggest an ending, or at least an epilogue. He returned to Munich in April 1946, found his family's home destroyed in Allied bombing, an irony he couldn't escape. His parents had died in the firebombing of Dresden, 2 brothers killed on the Eastern Front. He was, in most meaningful ways, alone. He found work as a translator. His newfound English fluency was valuable in occupied Germany. Later, teaching English to German children in the emerging Federal Republic. He married in 1952 a widow named Elizabeth who ran a bookshop in the Schwabing district. They had no children. In 1967, a British journalist researching the Guinea Pig Club tracked Vogel down for an interview. The article published in the Sunday Times included a photograph, Vogel at 68, his reconstructed face lined with age but unmistakably the work of Miller's hands. The nose slightly crooked, the ears simplified. The patchwork of skin grafts now weathered by 2 decades of life. The journalist asked the obvious question: how do you reconcile your past, a Nazi fighter ace, with what the Allies did for you? Vogel's answer was measured, translated from German. I cannot reconcile it. That is the point. The contradiction is the lesson. I believed human worth was measurable, that some lives mattered more than others. Then I became worthless by my own ideology's standards, and the people I'd been taught were inferior showed me I was wrong. Not through argument or propaganda, but through action, through surgery, through months of painful, expensive, utterly impractical compassion. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Major Miller once told me that flesh doesn't care about ideology. I think about that often. My reconstructed face is made from my own skin, yes, but it exists because of American innovation, British hospitality, and a philosophy that said even a burned Nazi deserved healing. That face, he gestured at himself, is a monument to the idea that human dignity isn't negotiable. Every time I look in a mirror, I see the refutation of everything I fought for. The journalist asked if he felt guilt. Always, Vogel replied. But guilt without transformation is just self-pity. I cannot undo my 80 kills, cannot bring back the pilots I shot down, but I can remember, can tell this story, can make sure that people understand the choice Germany made and what we lost when we decided some humans were disposable. Major Joseph Miller never sought fame. He returned to Boston after the war, established a private practice in reconstructive surgery, trained a generation of surgeons in the techniques he'd pioneered. He published papers in medical journals, dry, technical documents that reduced his art to measurements and procedural steps. But his patients told different stories. The factory worker whose face was rebuilt after an industrial accident, the burn victim from a house fire, the child born with severe facial deformities. Each one received not just Miller's surgical skill, but his fundamental philosophy: you are worth saving regardless of cost or convenience. In 1978, at age 70, Miller was interviewed for an oral history project documenting wartime medical innovations. The interviewer asked about his most challenging case. Miller thought for a long moment. There was a German pilot, he said finally. Hauptmann Hans Vogel, face destroyed by fire. Third-degree burns across 70% of facial surface area. Medically, it was complex, but not unprecedented. We'd done similar reconstructions on Allied pilots. What made it challenging then? The philosophical dimension. This was an enemy prisoner, a Nazi. If I'm honest, probably killed some of our pilots. And there were people, colleagues I respected, who argued we should prioritize our own wounded, that resources spent on Vogel were resources denied to Allied servicemen. How did you respond? I ignored them, because the moment you start making those calculations, this patient is worth saving, that one isn't, you've lost something fundamental. Medicine isn't about deserving, it's about need. Vogel needed reconstruction. I could provide it. That was the beginning and end of the ethical equation. The interviewer pressed, but wasn't there a symbolic dimension? Treating an enemy who'd fought for an ideology that viewed the disabled as disposable? Miller smiled, the expression caught on the grainy video that survives in archives. Of course there was. Every time I operated on Vogel, I was proving that our system was better. Not because we said it was, but because we demonstrated it. We didn't just talk about human dignity, we practiced it, even when it was expensive and inconvenient, and directed at someone who'd fought against us. That's the difference between propaganda and principle. He died in 1985. His obituary in the New England Journal of Medicine ran 3 pages, listing his innovations, his students, his contributions to plastic surgery. It mentioned his wartime service at East Grinstead, though not by name any specific patient. But Hans Vogel attended the funeral. He was 76 years old, traveling from Munich at considerable expense and difficulty. He stood at the back of the church during the service, his reconstructed face now aged and weathered, but still recognizably Miller's work. He didn't speak, didn't introduce himself to Miller's family, just stood, witnessed, and wept. As he left, he placed a single item on the memorial table, his guinea pig club tie clip, the one Mackenzie had given him in 1945. Pinned to it was a note written in precise English: You gave me back my face. But more than that, you gave me back my humanity. I spent 40 years living with the proof that everything I believed was wrong. Thank you for that burden. It was the only thing worth carrying. H. Vogel, to understand the full significance of what happened at Queen Victoria Hospital between 1944 and 1946, we must step back from individual stories and examine the collision of ideologies. The Nazi philosophy rested on a fundamental premise. Human worth was hierarchical, measurable, subject to optimization. At its apex were the physically perfect, mentally superior, racially pure. At its bottom were those deemed Lebensunwertes Leben, life unworthy of life. The disabled, the disfigured, the mentally ill, the racially undesirable. This wasn't mere rhetoric. Between 1939 and 1941, the Action T4 program systematically murdered over 70,000 disabled Germans, gassed, poisoned, starved. Doctors participated, many willingly. The logic was presented as compassionate. These people were suffering, non-productive, a drain on resources. Better to end their pain and free up hospital beds for those who could contribute to society. The program was semi-public knowledge. Propaganda films like Ich klage an, I accuse, depicted euthanasia as mercy. Families received letters explaining that their disabled relatives had died of pneumonia or heart failure, the bodies cremated to prevent disease. Most accepted the explanations. Some celebrated the efficiency. Hans Vogel grew up marinating in this philosophy. By the time he arrived at East Grinstead, his expectation of disposal wasn't paranoia. It was rational application of the worldview he'd absorbed. He had become one of the ballast existences. Of course, they would eliminate him. But the Allied approach, specifically the American medical philosophy embodied by Miller, rested on a contradictory premise. Human dignity was inherent, not earned. It couldn't be measured or optimized. It existed regardless of productivity, beauty, utility, or ideology. This wasn't just rhetoric either. The United States spent enormous resources on reconstructive surgery during and after World War II. The Army and Navy established specialized burn units. Surgeons like Miller were given time and funding to perfect experimental techniques. Patients underwent years of surgery, procedures that would never return them to combat effectiveness, that served no military purpose except affirming that these men mattered. The economic calculation was absurd. Each walking stock pedicle graft required months of hospital time, hundreds of surgical hours, expensive materials. The patient couldn't work during treatment. Many would never fully recover functionality. From a pure efficiency standpoint, Nazi logic was correct. Allocate resources to those who can contribute. Let the severely disabled die. But Miller and McIndoe rejected that calculation. And in doing so, they weren't just practicing medicine, they were waging philosophical warfare. Every successful reconstruction was a refutation of Nazi ideology. Every burned pilot who returned to society was proof that human worth wasn't tied to physical perfection. Every hour spent rebuilding an enemy prisoner's face was a demonstration that dignity transcended nationality and ideology. The Guinea Pig Club became inadvertently a monument to this principle. These men, horribly disfigured, many permanently disabled, weren't hidden away. They walked through East Grinstead openly, drank in pubs, courted local women, lived with dignity despite appearances that would have warranted execution in Nazi Germany. And Hans Vogel, thrust into this environment, experienced the ultimate cognitive dissonance, being treated as fully human by the people he'd been taught were subhuman, while facing the realization that his own side would have discarded him as trash. In the decades after the war, as Holocaust testimonies emerged and the full horror of Nazi ideology became undeniable, a question haunted Germany. How did ordinary people participate in such evil? The answer offered by philosophers like Hannah Arendt focused on the banality of evil, the idea that atrocity doesn't require monsters, just ordinary people following orders, accepting premises, calculating costs and benefits within a twisted moral framework. But Hans Vogel's story suggests a corollary, the extraordinariness of good. What Miller did wasn't ordinary. It wasn't the path of least resistance. Multiple colleagues suggested he focus on Allied patients. Hospital administrators worried about resource allocation. The military bureaucracy would have rubber-stamped a decision to provide only palliative care to enemy prisoners. Miller had to actively choose repeatedly to treat Vogel as fully human, had to argue for resources, had to defend his decision to spend hundreds of hours on a man who'd killed Allied pilots, had to override the natural human tendency toward tribal thinking, the U.S. versus them mentality that intensifies during war. This required moral courage, not just medical skill. And that courage wasn't unique to Miller. It was institutional. McIndoe supported him. The nursing staff treated Vogel with professional compassion. The Guinea Pig Club members welcomed him. The town of East Grinstead didn't protest. The Allied military command allowed it. This suggests something crucial. The philosophy of human dignity, however imperfectly practiced, was embedded in these institutions. It wasn't just Miller's personal ethics. It was a cultural value system that had enough weight to survive the pressures of war. Contrast this with Germany, where the medical establishment participated enthusiastically in Action T4, where hospital administrators organized the killing of their own patients, where the philosophical framework of human worth had been so corrupted that murder seemed efficient rather than monstrous. Vogel's reconstructed face became, in this context, a walking testimony, not to individual virtue, but to the difference between systems, between a culture that calculated human worth and one that presumed it, between a philosophy that optimized for efficiency and one that prioritized dignity. For 40 years after the war, Vogel lived with this testimony written in his flesh, the nose rebuilt from his own rib cartilage, the skin grafted from his chest, the eyelids fashioned from tissue behind his ears. Every element a reminder you were saved by the people you tried to kill according to principles you'd been taught to despise. In 1989, Hans Vogel died in Munich. He was 90 years old. The obituary in the Süddeutsche Zeitung was brief. Former Luftwaffe officer, English teacher, survived by his wife, Elizabeth. No mention of his reconstructed face, his time at East Grinstead, his transformation from Nazi ace to living refutation of Nazi ideology. But at his funeral, Elizabeth read a letter he'd written to be opened after his death. In it, Vogel described his experience at Queen Victoria Hospital. The expectation of cruelty met with compassion. The ideological certainty shattered by actual human encounter. The slow, painful recognition that everything he'd believed was wrong. The letter ended with an instruction. I have lived for 43 years with a face built by an American doctor who owed me nothing but cruelty. This face is my conscience, my monument, my constant reminder that human dignity is not theoretical. It is practical. It requires action, resources, sacrifice. It requires treating even your enemies as if they matter, because they do. Germany is reuniting now. East and West are becoming one again. As we rebuild our nation, I beg you, remember that some philosophies, no matter how efficient they seem, no matter how appealing their promises, lead inevitably to horror. The philosophy that says human worth is measurable, that some people are disposable, that efficiency trumps dignity, that philosophy destroyed our country once. Don't let it return. Look at my face. See what strangers built when they could have let me die. That is the alternative. That is what humanity looks like when it refuses to calculate worth. Remember it. The letter circulated among family, then friends, then local educators. In 1995, a teacher at a Munich gymnasium used it in a history class about the Holocaust. The students were skeptical. One man's story, however moving, couldn't capture the complexity of Nazi ideology and its refutation. But then the teacher showed them the photographs. Vogel before the fire, the propaganda poster face. Vogel after, the reconstructed patchwork. And finally, Vogel at 80, his face weathered by time, but still clearly the product of surgical intervention. One student, a girl named Anna, asked the question that cut to the heart of it. If the Americans could do this for an enemy, why couldn't Germany do it for its own people? The teacher had no answer, because there was no answer except the true one. Ideology had corrupted medicine, efficiency had replaced ethics, and the calculation of human worth had led to the gas chambers. Today, Queen Victoria Hospital still operates in East Grinstead. It's a modern facility now, far removed from the wartime wards where Miller and McIndoe pioneered their techniques. But there's a small museum dedicated to the Guinea Pig Club, filled with photographs and artifacts from that era. Among the displays, a surgical instrument kit used by Miller, a propaganda poster featuring a young Hans Vogel, photographs of the walking stock pedicle graft technique in various stages, letters from patients to their surgeons expressing gratitude and disbelief, and on one wall, a question written in large letters. What does it mean to treat someone as human? The museum doesn't provide an answer. Instead, it presents the evidence. Burned pilots rebuilt at enormous cost. Enemy prisoners given the same care as Allied servicemen. Disfigured men welcomed into society rather than hidden away. A philosophy of dignity practiced even when it was expensive, inconvenient, and directed at those who'd fought against it. Visitors, many of them medical students, walk through the exhibits in silence. They see the before and after photographs, read the testimonies, examine the surgical tools that transformed flesh, and, inadvertently, challenged ideologies. Some visitors are moved. Some are puzzled. A few are skeptical, questioning whether the resources spent on Vogel and others like him could have been better used elsewhere. The calculation persists, the very calculation Miller rejected. But that persistence is instructive, because the question never really goes away. What is a human life worth? How do we allocate limited resources? When do we decide someone isn't worth saving? Miller's answer, everyone is worth saving always, is impractical, impossible to implement universally. In a world of finite resources and infinite need, some form of triage is inevitable. But Vogel's face suggests a different lesson. Be very, very careful about the criteria you use. Because once you start measuring human worth, once you begin categorizing people as productive or useless, beautiful or monstrous, ally or enemy, you've started down a path that leads to places darker than any battlefield. The reconstructed face isn't just a medical achievement. It's a philosophical argument written in flesh and scar tissue. An argument that insists dignity isn't negotiable, that compassion can't be calculated, that the moment we start treating humans as problems to optimize is the moment we lose our own humanity. Hans Vogel lived for 43 years with that argument literally on his face. He couldn't escape it, couldn't deny it, couldn't rationalize it away. Every morning he looked in a mirror and saw proof that everything he'd believed was wrong. That must have been unbearable. It must also have been redemptive. Because transformation, real transformation, is always painful. It requires admitting you were wrong, that your worldview was corrupted, that you participated in evil. It requires living with that knowledge, day after day, year after year. Vogel did that. He carried the burden of his reconstructed face, his 80 kills, his complicity in an ideology that led to genocide. He couldn't undo any of it, but he could witness, could testify, could become in his own reluctant way a monument to the possibility of change. There's a footnote to this story, discovered in Miller's private papers after his death. A letter from Vogel, dated 1982, 3 years before Miller died, 7 years before Vogel's own death. In the letter, Vogel asks if Miller remembers a conversation they had in 1945 during one of the long periods between surgeries. Vogel had asked why Miller became a surgeon, what drew him to the work of rebuilding shattered faces. Miller's answer, according to Vogel's letter, was unexpected. Because faces are how we recognize each other as human. When I restore someone's face, I'm not just fixing tissue, I'm restoring their ability to be seen, to be recognized, to participate in the visual language of human society. Everyone deserves that. Not because they've earned it, but because recognition is a prerequisite for dignity. Vogel's letter continues. I think about that often, Doctor. You didn't just rebuild my face. You forced the world to see me again. Not as the propaganda poster, not as the monster, but as something in between. Something complicated. Something human. That was the real surgery, wasn't it? Not the walking stock grafts or the rib cartilage or the reconstructed eyelids. The real surgery was on everyone who looked at me and had to grapple with the contradiction. A Nazi given mercy. An enemy treated as an ally. A disposable life that someone decided to save. You made me into a question that people couldn't ignore. If even this man deserves compassion, what does that say about our categories? About our hierarchies? About our certainties that some people matter more than others? I have been that question for 37 years now. It has not been easy, but it has been necessary, and I am grateful, not for the comfort you gave me, because there was little comfort, but for the burden. for the responsibility of living as proof that your philosophy is stronger than mine ever was. Thank you for the last surgery, the one you performed on the world using my face as your instrument." Miller never responded to the letter. Perhaps he didn't know how. Perhaps the gratitude made him uncomfortable. He'd always insisted he was just doing his job, that there was nothing extraordinary about treating patients regardless of nationality or ideology. But the letter survived in his papers, carefully preserved. And in that preservation, perhaps there's an acknowledgement. What happened at East Grinstead wasn't ordinary. It was exceptional. It was a deliberate choice to practice medicine as if human dignity mattered more than efficiency, more than tribal loyalty, more than revenge. That choice, repeated in hundreds of surgeries over years of treatment, rebuilt more than faces. It rebuilt the possibility of believing that compassion is stronger than ideology, that our common humanity outweighs our differences, that even in the midst of the most destructive war in human history, there's space for mercy. Hans Vogel's reconstructed face was the proof. Imperfect, asymmetrical, obviously artificial, but undeniably human. And in its very imperfection, a reminder. Humanity itself is imperfect, complicated, impossible to optimize. We can only choose again and again to treat each other as if we matter, even when it's expensive, even when it's inconvenient, even when every calculation says we shouldn't. That's the legacy written in Vogel's reconstructed flesh. That's what an American doctor built on a Nazi's face. Not just a nose and eyelids and functional features, but a testament to the idea that dignity, once granted, can never be fully revoked. The monster they called him became a man again, not because he earned it, but because someone decided he deserved the chance. That decision, more than any battle, more than any treaty, might be the most important victory of World War II.